Quirky Earthbound-inspired indie RPGs. If you've been in the gaming sphere for the past couple years, you've no doubt heard this term or any number of variations on it thrown around. Sometimes the term is used to mock the games being described, and other times it's very clearly being used as a joke. Point is that this type of RPG exists, and some people seem to really hate it. So, in order to get to the bottom of this, and as an excuse to play a bunch of games that I've been meaning to get to for quite some time, I marathoned the most prolific games in this quote-unquote genre with the intent of making a video on it. This video exists to explain what makes these games so special, whether or not the label of Earthbound inspired is accurate, and why there seems to be a good deal of hate for this type of game. I hope you enjoy. Earthbound. It's a strange game to come back to nowadays because mechanically it's kind of a mess. Not even in the sense of stuff like homesickness, where being unfun to deal with is the point. It's a fairly poorly designed RPG in a lot of regards. Reviving party members is unnecessarily tedious. Inventory management has no distinction between consumables and key items, causing you to run out of space really fast. And the early game is filled with absolutely brutal slugfests where your chances of success effectively amount to how much of an ass the RNG feels like being on that day. You might get the impression that I absolutely hate this game, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Dare I say, Earthbound's mechanical eccentricities are not just really endearing, but a necessary sacrifice in order to get what the game manages to accomplish. Series creator Shigesato Itoi wasn't originally involved with the gaming industry before creating the first Mother game, and instead he was, among other things, a copywriter and an anti-war activist. So Itoi's status as an outsider to conventional game design is a very likely reason for the aforementioned eccentricities. This outsider status does have its fair share of benefits though. In particular, it resulted in Earthbound having something that a lot of games don't have: sincerity. Between the fact that the series was created as a way to bond with his daughter, the dialogue that reflects his own sense of humor / general outlook on life, and even the title of the series being a reference to a song that he relates to his life experiences, it's abundantly clear that the Mother series is very personal to Itoi. And this sincerity resulted in a game with more complex themes than you'd expect to see around that time. As one last example that people on the site I've talked about to death, there's a reason Earthbound ends with a final boss inspired by Itoi's own personal loss of childhood innocence. At its core, Earthbound is a game about growing up and realizing this blue trap bubble isn't always sunshine and rainbows. Across his journey, Ness discovers everything from cult activity to systemic corruption. But instead of using this realization as an excuse to give into misanthropy and add to the bad things in the world like Gaius, Ness chooses to see the good in humanity and does what he can to make the world a better place. But of course, this is just the reading I personally subscribe to, as there are countless alternative but equally interesting readings that exist for Earthbound. No, not that one. Earthbound transcends being just another set of mechanical systems, and when the credits roll, it's apparent that you just finished a genuine work of art. However, Itoi isn't the only person that Earthbound is personal to, as it's also built in a way that encourages players to forge a personal connection to it. The game lets you choose your favorite food and thing in general, names Ness's main offensive spell after what you chose for the latter, and later starts to play with the distinction between Ness the character and you the player in interesting ways. If you play this game while growing up, it's likely going to stick with you for a long time. This is why Earthbound has such a passionate fan community that even got its own Wikipedia page despite how small the series is in the grand scheme of things. This is why Earthbound is one of those games that people will just never stop talking about, especially on the site you're watching this on. And finally, this is why there's so many games inspired by Earthbound. Of course, adding fuel to this fire is the game's follow-up, Mother 3. While most of the games inspired by the Mother series tend to take more from Earthbound than the other two games, having another game that most people would consider to be of similar, if not greater quality, certainly isn't hurting matters. But Mother 3's most important contribution to the rise of Earthbound-inspired games is how it's a conclusive ending for the series. And honestly, good. It's better to end on a high note and with your credibility intact than to beat your series into the ground and kill any goodwill it previously had. I'm a Castlevania fan. I would know this. However, this means that there's going to be an unsatiated demand from other games, so naturally there's an incentive for creators touched by Earthbound to create games inspired by it. But rather than create games that simply transfer the surface level mechanics and stylistic choices of Earthbound, these creators would instead be inspired by the idea of making something deeply personal. The end result would be several games with their own distinct identities. The first of these quote-unquote quirky Earthbound-inspired indie RPGs is from 2004, predating even Mother 3, and it's a game that active viewers of this channel would no doubt be familiar with. Yume Nikki is my favorite game ever made. You can watch my video on it if you want the full details on why that is, but for the sake of the video you're watching now, I'm just going to focus on its connection to Earthbound and influence on later games. At a quick glance, Yume Nikki is nothing like Earthbound. One is a grand adventure narrative with a ton of dialogue, while the other is just a series of dreams with no dialogue whatsoever. Yume Nikki barely even qualifies as an RPG, and the only reason it's called one is because of the engine it was made in. But Earthbound was undeniably an influence. Within Yume Nikki, there are various FC worlds that capture the aesthetic of the Famicom and one game in particular, Mother 1. In addition, one of these worlds went as far to include a reference to two glitches from Earthbound. With this in mind, it's clear that Kikiyama is at the very least a fan of the Mother series. So beyond these homages, what parts of Earthbound made their way into Yume Nikki? Well, instead of taking surface level aspects like the RPG combat or the wacky dialogue, the part of Earthbound that Yume Nikki takes is the idea of emotional vulnerability, specifically conveyed through adolescent silent protagonists. I've seen plenty of people draw parallels between things in Yume Nikki like Uboa and Celestial Face, and darker moments in Earthbound like the one that everyone already knows about, and it's not hard to see why. They both elicit the same emotions of being exposed to scary things as a kid and not being able to handle it, albeit in different contexts. Yume Nikki would go on to inspire a lot of games, resulting in the term Yume Nikki fan game being coined. One game that drew heavy inspiration from Yume Nikki was a small hour-long fan game called Lisa the First, which used the format of exploring dreams to tell the story of a girl dealing with abuse and trauma. Dingaling, the game's creator, would later take to Kickstarter and crowdfund a sequel that's larger in scope. And on December 15, 2014, the sequel, Lisa the Painful, would be released to the world. Lisa the Painful would follow Brad Armstrong, brother to Lisa, as the world experiences an apocalyptic event where every woman disappears. And while the setting is completely different from Earthbound, both games just have a similar sense of humor / overall feel. Dingaling himself has credited Earthbound as an inspiration in multiple interviews.
I know I keep bringing this up, and this is like a thing that revolves about, man, Earthbound, that game. Not only is that like just a game that I love as a game, but I swear to God, that game shaped just the way I view everything in general. The like you're saying, it's wholesome on the surface, but there's certain things you can dig under, and it's like, whoa, this is adult, you know? It's crazy, and just I really love that kind of candy-coated shit, or like, I don't know, candy-coated darkness or whatever.
Lisa's sense of humor is certainly more adult than Earthbound, though. After all, I'm not exactly 100% sure that Nintendo would allow killing several children as a joke in one of their games. Anyway, something else that's important to note is that Earthbound's influence extends beyond just other RPGs. For example, the webcomic / massive rabbit hole Homestuck takes quite a bit of influence from Earthbound. In particular, one of the comic's main composers, who went by the handle Flug Radiation, was an active poster to Starman.net as a teenager, even going as far to make a questionably aged Earthbound ROM hack. Sometime later, this man would start a Kickstarter for some obscure game called Undertale, and that man's name is Toby Fox. Just like Yume Nikki and Lisa, Undertale draws inspiration from Earthbound, namely the humor, the atmosphere, and the dynamic of the player character versus the real-life human controlling them. But what separates Undertale from the other two games I've talked about is how it managed to become a mainstream hit. At its height, it was basically inescapable online.
Recently, I was looking through my daughter's phone and I found many pictures of a cartoon skeleton with one glowing blue eye and wearing a hoodie. How do I help my daughter not be attracted to such demonic things?
And because of its popularity, Undertale's connections to Earthbound would be a frequent point of discussion. Even some small and upcoming channel made a video about said connections that would never attract any response and switch or notoriety whatsoever. So naturally, a small number of dedicated Undertale fans who want something else like it are going to look for games with similar points of inspiration. One such game is 2008's Off, a game that Toby Fox has mentioned as an inspiration in some regards. Just like Undertale, it plays with the dynamic of the player and the character they're controlling in a similar manner to Earthbound. Other similarities include how Lost protagonist uses a bat as their primary weapon, just like Ness, and how the main task of defeating 3 Zone Guardians is similar to Earthbound's main task of defeating 8 Sanctuary Guardians. In addition, not only was one of the main people behind the official English translation an active poster to the Starman.net forums, who even posted the translation there, but in an interview, Mortis Ghost himself said that Mother 3 is his favorite game of all time. The connections between these two games are really obvious. Just as long as you ignore the fact that I conveniently cropped out the part of the same interview where Mordisco says he hadn't played any game in the Mother series until after working on Off. Yeah, a lot of the supposed Earthbound-inspired RPGs actually have nothing to do with Earthbound. Space Colonel's creator denied the connection in the same interview as Mortis Ghost. Hylic draws more from Yume Nikki and Space Colonel than it does from Earthbound. One of the key people behind One Shot has said on record that she doesn't even like Earthbound. And in the cases of the games that actually are inspired by Earthbound, just referring to them as that is fairly reductive, as they have plenty of additional sources of inspiration. Yume Nikki might be inspired by the works of Osamu Sada, although it's impossible to be 100% sure when Kikiyama is as secretive as they are. Lisa has Fist of the North Star, and Undertale has a whole host of inspirations, including but not limited to Shin Megami Tensei, Moon, Brandish, Mario and Luigi, Mr. Bean. I do think that the games referred to as Quirky Earthbound-inspired RPGs have a common link though. Aside from the Mother series itself, the games I've talked about up until this point have all been made in RPG Maker or made by someone familiar with RPG Maker in the case of Undertale, so there's inevitably going to be similarities between these games. Not even in the sense of them having the same sources of inspiration, although I'd wager that more of these games take influence from Yume Nikki than Earthbound, but in the sense that using a relatively limited piece of software is going to inherently cause similarities. It's kind of like the scientific theory of analogous evolution, where animals that are far away from each other on the evolutionary tree can have similar adaptations if they both live in a biome that necessitates those adaptations. I personally believe that the reason that there's confusion over what's Earthbound inspired is because of the Earthbound series' unique online reputation. All I'm saying is that the huge Earthbound fan excited to play it for the first time article exists for a reason. So many people will gas up Earthbound without actually understanding what makes it special, and they'll just end up either seeing anything that's weird and so dark as Earthbound inspired, or acting like common game/story tropes are specific to Earthbound. Adding on to this is how a good chunk of the actual Earthbound inspired games are often ignored in these discussions. Citizens of Earth, Jimmy and the Pulsating Mass, and the two fan attempts at a Mother 4 are pretty obviously Earthbound inspired, but they don't get brought up as examples of quirky Earthbound inspired indie RPGs as much as the aforementioned games that have nothing to do with Earthbound. Overall though, while the categorization of games as Earthbound inspired, regardless of how much they actually have to do with Earthbound, is absolutely annoying, it's ultimately harmless so far. I can just write it off as people wanting to share games they like with others, and if it means some genuinely good games get more of an audience, then so be it. It's not something that's worth being pedantic over. However, after a couple years, something would begin to change. The small but vocal discussion of quirky Earthbound-inspired indie RPGs started to become significantly more negative. In particular, jokes about these games started to mix with jokes about all indie games being about depression that previously weren't specific to Earthbound-inspired games. So, what happened? Well, I believe there's two causes, or more specifically, two games.
Where's the piece of this puzzle? I'm begging, please.
Yiik, a postmodern RPG, or technically Y2K, but no one actually calls it that, is a fascinating rabbit hole. The kind where the more you look at it, the deeper it seems to go. Upon its release in January of 2019, it was absolutely stormed with hate for a variety of reasons. The combat system, the writing, the main character, and the many controversies, chief among them being the way it handled a character based on a real-life death. This game would end up having a fair bit of staying power, both from the onslaught of video essays based on it and the ironic meme culture that formed around it, meaning that the negative attitude towards it would fester in people's mind for quite a while. And Yiik is undeniably inspired by Earthbound. The creators have said so multiple times, and the majority of reviews of the game felt the need to mention it. So a lot of the negativity directed towards Yiik could eventually extend to quirky Earthbound-inspired RPGs in general. But in order for this extension of negativity to take place, there would need to be one final push. And that final push was the December 2020 release of Omori. Omori was the perfect storm that would result in hatred for quirky Earthbound-inspired indie RPGs. It was popular enough to attract a lot of attention, including a quote-unquote cringy fandom. It had its fair share of legitimate issues, be it issues with the game itself, like its pacing, or more serious controversies surrounding its creator. And finally, due to the game dealing with mental health, it allowed for the idea of quirky Earthbound-inspired indie RPGs to mix with the jokes of all indie games dealing with depression, creating the new label of quirky Earthbound-inspired indie RPG with themes of depression. But while these two individual games were the catalyst for the hey, quirky Earthbound-inspired indie RPGs get, what is the fundamental reason this hate exists? Why does a small but vocal group of gamers have such a negative gut reaction to this type of game? Well, the answer is simple. Now, don't get me wrong, if you asked a group of gamers if they thought games are art, they'd unanimously say yes. But what a lot of them really want isn't games actually being treated like art, it's just the aesthetic of games being art so that their time playing games seems like it's spent on something grander. So, a lot of gamers have a knee-jerk reaction to things that would be a given for any other artistic medium, like discussions about how games can improve in terms of stuff like representation, or the notion of games that want to be something other than fun. The latter absolutely applies to the backlash against quirky Earthbound-inspired indie RPGs. It's also worth pointing out that a fair amount of the criticism towards these games has a reactionary component to it. In my research, I found that a lot of the people complaining about quirky Earthbound-inspired indie RPGs just so happen to be alt-right. This isn't to say that if you don't personally like quirky Earthbound-inspired RPGs or artsier games in general, you're automatically a bad person. No, I totally understand not liking these games, as there's a variety of reasons not to. But there's a difference between personally not caring for a game on an individual level and having a melodramatic spiel about how it existing is single-handedly ruining gaming. And I should also make it clear that this goes the other way around. Those snobs who legitimately look down on people for something as simple as liking a game just because it's fun are also annoying. I guess what I'm trying to say is that games can mean so many different things to so many different people. The stories they tell, the people you played them with, and the tough times they got you through. Many of the games I've talked about today are great examples of this. Yume Nikki helped me contextualize feelings of anxiety and isolation I've dealt with for what seems like my whole life, and ones that were heightened around the time I played it. I've also heard many people share similar experiences of how when they played Undertale they felt seen in a way that few games could compare to. And even if I don't personally care for Omori for a variety of reasons, hearing people talk about how it relates to their own personal mental health is still invaluable. In terms of discussions about games, I've stopped caring about what games people like and instead started caring about why other people like them, because the latter is way more interesting to me. So I think that's why part of me gets upset when I see people snarkily dismiss quote-unquote quirky Earthbound-inspired indie RPGs without playing or even having bare minimum knowledge about them. It's not so much that I don't like seeing people talk shit about games I like. It's that I don't like seeing people deny themselves an opportunity to learn more about not just a medium they clearly love, but the people who love it just as much as they do.